Good morning, everybody. We'll get started in a few minutes, right at 10:45 Eastern Time. Looking forward to spending this morning with you. All right, good morning, everybody. It's 10:45 Eastern Time, and so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for your patience. This is my first time ever live streaming, so a little bit nervous. Hopefully, this is all going right. Um, we're going to spend about 20 minutes this morning going over 5 key points related to working with our unaccompanied immigrant students. So about 20 minutes of that, and then we have a good 5 to 10 minutes for questions for whoever is live with us here today. If you could, in the chat on the YouTube, if you want to say your name, where you're from, what your position is, that would be great. What you teach and what have you. And but if you wouldn't mind saving your questions until the last to the Q&A period, that would be helpful because we don't have tech support today, and I am trying to monitor your questions on a separate device. All right, so here we go. From unaccompanied alone to welcomed and supported. Our first key point this morning, again, we're going to go through 5 points. The time to prepare is now. Okay, and so what I mean by that is I want to show you this flow chart here that we laid out. So not all unaccompanied immigrant students will come through the system, perhaps if they're not apprehended at the border, for example, but most of our students most of our students will come through this system. So what happens is, if they're apprehended at the border, they will be in the custody of the Department of Homeland Security for up to 72 hours. At least by law, it's supposed to be up to 72 hours. Occasionally, it's a little longer than that, but it's supposed to be maximum of 72 hours. And when they're with Department of Homeland Security, these are the facilities that we often see on the news, the ones where kids are literally in cage-like facilities, maybe not so much access to taking a shower. They have those little aluminum foil-like blankets, not a lot of ability to make phone calls, just a really not friendly situation for children, okay? After that, they're transferred to the care and custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, okay? ORR, that's the Federal Office of Refugee Resettlement. And the facilities that they're in with ORR vary widely, okay? So some children are in shelters, small shelters, or small group homes, really appropriate situations for young children, right? In other cases, especially when there's a large surge on the border, they may be in influx facilities, which are not ideal, where you can kind of picture the bunk beds after bunk beds after bunk beds kind of situation. But if you want to learn more about the types of ORR facilities, I'll be sure to, after this ends, I'll be sure to post the PowerPoint today on the YouTube chat. And all of these links are hyperlinked. So on the Federal Office of Refugee Resettlement website, they have a whole handbook where you can read about the different types of facilities and all sorts of other details that you might be interested in. But in general, let's call them shelters, because in many cases they are sheltered. So they're in one of these ORR shelters. And the current average of time that they're in there is about 35 days. That varies greatly. In some cases, they're going to be in there longer. In some cases, it's going to be shorter. It also depends on, current conditions on the border and that type of thing. But right now, I'm recording this in, July of 2021, it's right around 35 days. So just think about kind of a month in general. Now, what happens during that month that they're in there is there's a family reunification investigation going on. And so what we mean by that is the child is working with a social worker or a case manager or someone like that, and they're working hard to find who in the United States is available, what relatives are here of the child. Is it mom, dad, aunt, uncle, grandma, cousin, former neighbor, someone who's available to take the child? And there's fingerprints that has to be done, and all, they have, the potential sponsor has to fill out what's called the family reunification packet. There's a whole procedure that goes on, and then eventually they're released to that family member. We don't have time today to get into all the process and the criteria for family reunification, but again, once I post the PowerPoint, you'll have access to the links, and you'll see below in the pink, there's a hyperlink for more information about the process and criteria for family reunification. Lastly, on this flow chart, you will see in the bottom dotted lines, it says deportation proceedings, okay? This is very key to understand. These children are all in deportation proceedings, okay? So what that means is they all need an immigration attorney to argue their case, or they're going to be deported. So when they get out, when they get released to a family member, that is not a green light to say you can now stay in the United States. That's simply the government saying, okay, we found somewhere for you to stay while your immigration case is pending. So because sometimes it takes years to get through the immigration court system, okay? All right, we're gonna move along, but that's a sense of the timeline. So all these kids that we're seeing on the news, they're gonna go through this system fairly quickly for the most part. And so they're likely enrolling in your schools now, and there will be many of them in the fall. All right, the second key point is that the Office of Refugee Resettlement's definition of unaccompanied minor is not the same that we use in education. And in education, we typically use the McKinney-Vento Act definition, but there's overlap in the two populations. Okay, so here is ORR's definition, as well as Department of Homeland Security, basically the federal government's definition in terms of like the immigration world. Basically, we're talking about children who they have no lawful immigration status in the United States. They're not yet 18, and they're without a parent or legal guardian at the time they're apprehended by immigration authorities, usually at the border, right? So um, I think sometimes we, I don't know, think about, children wandering through the desert on their own or what have you. That's not normally the case. Usually they are with an aunt, an uncle, maybe siblings, cousins, or other kids that they've met along the journey, or people they've paid to help them make the journey. They're not usually alone. But if they get to the border and they're without a parent or legal guardian, the federal government deems them as unaccompanied and funnels them into this system that I'm describing today. So here we go, looking at the overlap with the McKinney-Vento definition that we often use in schools, okay? On the left-hand side here, and the white, if you have a child who's just unaccompanied per the Office of Refugee Resettlement definition, this would be that child who crosses the border without their parent or legal guardian, but they get released to a parent in the United States. So after the family reunification investigation and so on, they're released to mom or dad, okay? They're gonna show up to enroll in your school, and depending on who's enrolling them, they may not notice anything unique. They see mom, they see dad, they fill out the paperwork, done, okay. Most of us, we're gonna kind of pick up on the fact that something's a little off here. We're gonna notice pretty quickly that the student doesn't really know their parent and the parent doesn't really know their child. Maybe they haven't seen each other in 5, 10, 15 years. But in general, the people in the white over here, they're not going to be flagged in any special way in our system unless we as a school district decide to create some kind of special designation. And even then you have to be really careful about that, because remember, all of these students are undocumented. So most districts kind of shy away from doing something like that. But I know in one district I used to work in, we did have kind of an intake form type thing. And we made a note to ourselves, if a child, this has nothing to do with immigration status, but just in general, if a child had been separated from their parents at some point in their past. So, things like that can be helpful. Okay, going to the dark blue side over here, if we have a student who is just unaccompanied per McKinney-Vento and our, education definition, this could be a child who crosses the border either with their parent or guardian, or maybe they're never apprehended by Homeland Security. But for whatever reason, they're not funneled into that ORR system I've been talking about. But when they make their way to us, maybe they do end up living alone. Maybe they're one of our, 18, 19, 20-year-olds who rents a room, is basically working full time and trying to get through school, that type of thing. Or they're living with someone other than their parent or legal guardian. So in those cases, McKinney-Vento would kind of kick in, and hopefully you can check with your homeless liaison to see what resources would be available. The light blue, when we look at the overlap, these would be students who they crossed the border alone, or again, without their parent or legal guardian, and they then get released. The federal government did all their process of background checks and so on, but they get released to an aunt or an uncle, a grandparent, somebody who does not have legal guardianship. Okay, so then McKinney-Vento would kick in, and this is a child who had just gone through the ORR system. So it's a bit complicated. I hope that's helpful, but in general, the trainings that we do here at Immigrant Connections tend to focus on students that fall in the white category and the light blue. We don't tend to get so much into the dark blue students. Okay. All right, number 3, youth from Guatemala make up the largest percentage of unaccompanied minors, and many of these youth have indigenous or Maya roots. So here's a little bit on the data, and you can see over the years, so it used to be more like a third, a third, a third when it comes to kids from Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And then, yes, there are other countries involved, but these are the three main ones. But as you can see over time, Guatemala has increased greatly. And so we're now at the point where almost half of the kids are from Guatemala. And a significant number of them, and we don't have a lot of exact data on this, but a huge percentage of them are indigenous Maya. Okay. And so I know in a lot of cases in schools, we recognize that our students from Guatemala they speak another language, they speak another dialect, what have you. But I don't think we fully wrap our brains around what all of that means. We're not just talking about another language. We're talking about cultures. We're talking about Mayan nations. We're talking about Native Americans, indigenous populations. Okay, so um, these Native American populations, they're not Hispanic, they're not Latino, they're not Latinx, they're Native Americans. And so many don't speak Spanish. Some may speak Spanish as a second language. But I think one of the most important things to emphasize on this slide is that this is a group that had collectively, all of the Mayan communities have experienced generations of historical trauma and persecution, and they have a history of surviving by hiding their identities. Okay, so I want you to think about what that would look like when you have a student and their family coming in to register, and your home language survey or your registration paperwork only has a box that checks Spanish, but maybe their mom or quiche or canchobal. And so we need to think about our paperwork. We need to think about, I know whenever I work with a Guatemalan family, I always ask, oh, habla otro idioma. Do you speak another language? And then they see, I know, I get it. And then they're like, oh yeah, I speak, Quechua or something. And so, finding ways to kind of build trust and ask some questions and think about our paperwork, I think will go a long way, because I can guarantee you, even if you have a large Mayan population in your district, if you look at your data, it's probably all still going to say, or most of it's going to say Spanish, 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 Hispanic, Hispanic, Hispanic. So this is a hidden population oftentimes, and I think we're not, supporting them in the way that we need to. All right, number 4, you can look up data on unaccompanied minors released to your area. This is not hidden at all. And so again, when I post the PowerPoint in a comment here, you can go back and look at these links, but on the Federal Office of Refugee Resettlement, as well as the US Department of Health and Human Services, which is above ORR, they provide data by the county, and you can go back several years. So a lot of times when I'm working with a district, we will look together at the pattern over the years. Okay, let's look in, Harris County and see, how many unaccompanied minors have we had over the years, and just look at the patterns and see that, okay, if this is increased, what do we need to do this year? That type of thing. And it's important to note that you'll see they give a caveat on the data that I believe if a county has less than 50 unaccompanied minors, they won't show up in this data. For some reason, they only put them if it's above 50. So if you're a really, small area, or your area doesn't receive many unaccompanied minors, you may not show up in the list of counties. And then also remember that overlap with the definitions. So you can look at how many of these, this data is going to tell you per ORR's definition, how many unaccompanied minors have been released to sponsors, parents, relatives in your county. And if you look at your school system data, that's going to be using most likely the McKinney-Vento definition. And so they're not going to be the same number. Okay, but then it's definitely, food for thought for sure. I highly recommend everyone look at that data. And then number 5 is the importance about learning about trauma-informed practices for immigrant and refugee students, and of course, in this case, we're talking about unaccompanied minors. Many of you know that the journey that many of these unaccompanied minors take is horrific. This is an example. Many of you are familiar with this train, often referred to as the Beast, that is a cargo train that goes through Mexico. Many children and families, other individuals, ride on top of the train as a, you know, I don't want to say quick and easy because clearly it's not quick and easy, but a quicker perhaps way to get through Mexico, considering it's a very, very long country. But as you can imagine, again, this is not a train that's for people. So they're on top, people fall off, they lose limbs, the gangs control the top, women are raped. It's a really horrific journey. That's one little snippet. I mean, obviously, in a lot of our trainings, we get into the push and pull factors, meaning the reasons why these youth are fleeing Central America. And so there's all the trauma that may have happened back home. There's trauma during the flight here, during the journey, and often trauma here once they get to the United States as well, depending on what community they're living in. If they're renting a room in the cheapest part of a you know, urban area with a lot of crime, that type of thing, you know, they're likely going to be experiencing a fair amount of trauma here as well. So this is a really important framework that we like to use in a lot of our training and our work. It was created by Dr. Heidi Ellis and her team out of Boston Children's Hospital. And the reason why I think this is important is because, as you'll see here, they look at 4 core stressors. Okay, we've got the light blue is trauma, then acculturative stress, resettlement, and isolation, kind of going clockwise. So we just kind of talked very briefly about trauma, and that's a lot of, I think, what we focus on in education is, you know, trauma, 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 but also these other 3 areas are frankly equally as important. And so Dr. Heidi Ellis and her team, they talk about acculturative stress, all the stress related to adapting to the culture, learning the language. This could also tie in with a lot of these children, they have to adapt to additional family members, new step parents, new siblings, that type of thing. They're all at different acculturation levels. So the child might be the only one suddenly in this new family that doesn't speak English and doesn't really understand the culture. There's a lot going on there. Then if we circle down and we go to resettlement, this is the area that really focuses on poverty and the legal status piece, which again, for most of these kids, remember, they're undocumented. They have a court date. They're handed a date, right? They have a court date coming up, and it's their responsibility to get themselves an attorney, whether hopefully pro bono or you know, low cost. But it's not a public defender type situation. They're not given an attorney. They have to go out and find their own attorney. Very, very stressful to not know what's going to happen with your case. Am I going to be deported back to where I just fled from? And in many cases, I'm in danger of being killed, right? So there's so much stress with that. And then the final section would be isolation. And think about the sources of support that the student may have had back home. Maybe they grew up with grandma, maybe they went to school and they had a lot of friends, they went to church, their neighborhood buddies, what have you. And then here, their world is turned upside down and they're, you know, feeling isolated. And on top of that, this area would encompass discrimination, stigma, bias, racism, all of that, all the anti-immigrant sentiment that's often in our schools, unfortunately, in our communities, in our country. So take a look at that. I think it's just really crucial because we can't only focus on the blue section. We have to acknowledge these other 3 sections. All right, so that, well, let me do this slide and then we gotta wrap it up. But the only thing I want to highlight here, is this idea of risk and protective factors. Okay, this comes from public health. It's also used. I'm a social worker. It's often used in our field a lot. But basically, a lot of these students have risk factors, as we've discussed, and protective factors are the things that are going to help buffer that. These are the things that we want to build up in our students. And so the research shows that for immigrant and refugee kids, the most evidence-based protective factors are these 4 items here. And for the interest of time, I'm just going to touch on the first 2. But you can see school connectedness and peer support. These 2 items are exactly what we as educators we can do these things. We can help with these things in the classroom, at the classroom level. So how are we helping students connect with others? How are we helping them feel like they belong, providing that, welcoming environment? And then peer support. Are we, do we have any kind of formal or informal peer mentoring programs, or, just some way to connect the newcomers with maybe a student who speaks their same language, who's been here a little bit longer, that type of thing. Those 2 things are not just warm and fuzzy. There's very clear evidence that it ultimately supports students' mental health and social emotional well-being. All right, we don't have a lot of time, obviously, today. We're going to go into our Q&A section, but before we do that, I just wanted to let you know that if this topic interests you, we do both synchronous and asynchronous trainings on this topic. And you're in luck because we have one of our synchronous trainings coming up this Tuesday, July 27th from 1 to 4 Eastern time. So that should accommodate our West Coast friends. And you can sign up for that. So it's 3 hours. And then another synchronous training that we're actually doing, we have a colleague, a lawyer colleague, Natasha Quiroga, who's helping with both of these trainings. So she's also doing one on August 10th on how to support students in their immigration journey, the legal perspective. So there's going to be the one on the left is me and Natasha together, so social worker lawyer combo. The one on the right is just Natasha. I'll be in the background, but it's all Natasha. Okay. And then here's the asynchronous version of our content on supporting unaccompanied immigrant youth. We house this course on the English Learner portal with our colleagues over there, and you can get a sense there of the outline. And there is our contact information. And so I will leave that up. We've got about 6 minutes or so for questions. And so I will take a look at the YouTube and see if anybody is here and has any questions today. I will leave the chat up, or sorry, the contact information up. And if you are here and would like to type in a question into YouTube, let me know. I'm happy to answer some questions. I'm going to do a stop share right now so you all can see me. So again, we have a couple more minutes. If anyone would like to ask any questions, I will be here until 11:15, 4 more minutes Eastern time. Thanks, Beth. Beth, do you have any questions? Or anyone else out there? Now is your chance. Sorry that I'm looking down. I'm trying to use 2 devices here. If anyone has any questions, we've got a couple more minutes. If we don't have any questions, I might go back and do that one other slide then, if we have time. Let's share this. All right, I'm going to back up and do that. Beth does have a question. Yeah, the McKinney-Vento definition, is this well known in schools? A little hard for me to say because my experience as is school social worker, and then also I've worked on a family engagement team. But so both districts I worked in both positions in my world, it was very commonly known. I don't know actually for the average, ESL teacher or teacher, but every district, every school district across the country, as well as each state, has to have a homeless liaison. Sometimes that person may wear multiple hats. In the districts I've worked in, they're larger. And so if the homeless liaison, we even had homeless teams. So there was a homeless liaison with a whole department in cases. And I don't have the McKinney-Vento definition. I don't want to say it wrong. I don't have it off the top of my head. But in general, we're looking at students who are without their parent or legal guardian, or are, they're living entirely on their own, renting a room, that type of situation. Okay, any other questions? I'll say that last, the one item I wanted to share on that slide that was the risk and protective factors that we didn't get to. Well, there are actually two items, but I'll highlight one. The third bullet on that slide was the integrative acculturation style. And so I think this one has to do with helping our students to be bicultural. So a lot of times in schools, I find that we do a good job of emphasizing the importance of bilingualism, but we don't often talk enough about the importance of biculturalism. And studies show that students who kind of take the best of both worlds, again, integrative, you kind of integrate your identities, those students do the best from a, like a mental health, social emotional well-being kind of standpoint. All right, well, it's 11:15. I don't see any more questions, so I'm going to sign off, and then I will go ahead and put the PowerPoint, like a Google link to the PowerPoint in the YouTube chat, so hopefully folks can access it. So thank you for those of you who were able to join today. Have a great Saturday.